Well, this is TNG 2014. I am with one of my heroes of the faith, not just in a historical sense, but in a spiritual sense, with David Barton. David Barton, your ministry, your website, your material is absolutely amazing. I've grown immensely, my family, and my prayer is that the people here at TNG would learn not just about who you are, but what God has called you to do. So we are thankful that you are here today. Thank you for coming to TNG 2014.
It's my pleasure. Great to be here.
Now, my question to you in the opening is, what is something God has pressed upon your heart right now in 2014? We know with religious freedoms, we know we're under attack. What is God teaching you right now? And as an educator and historian, what are you learning and what do you want to convey, not just here in this event, but across the country to Americans, particularly to evangelicals?
I would say that the thing that has stand out to me, and it goes to something I've been seeing for years, I've been into stats for years, and that's how I got started 25 years ago with stats. Just finished a book with David Barton. It's all about stats and what's going on, but of course George looks at stats inside the church. That's what I've been looking at. The thing that I'm onto right now is Christians don't know the Bible. We have about 90% of Christians who have never read through the Bible from cover to cover once in a lifetime. You can't have a biblical worldview if you don't know what the Bible says. So what we're looking at is right now in America, only 1 out of 3 Christians believes that there is absolute truth. And when you're looking at 2 out of 3 that don't believe there's absolute truth, that's 2 out of 3 that say, I'm not sure the Bible is really relevant. So you can't have a biblical worldview and you can't have biblical literacy if you don't know that. And I point back to even some of our least religious founding fathers like Ben Franklin. I do this to preachers all the time. Just had a group of 500 preachers. I read them that speech. It's really, it's 11 sentences out of his speech at the Constitutional Convention where he's calling for prayer. And I always ask them, how many Bible verses did you see? And they always say 2. And I show them 14 Bible verses that are in that speech. So that's preachers who don't recognize God's Word, and yet your least religious founding father quotes the Bible 14 times in a speech. That's a difference that we got going right now. So that's what I'm on to, is how practical the Bible is, how relevant it is. There's a great book done in 1848 by John Quincy Adams, who was our president, and he shows 10-year-olds how to read through the Bible from cover to cover once every year. And so if we can get Christians to read through the Bible from cover to cover once a year, that's what will turn the country around.
Well, I sure appreciate it. Let me ask you this. Why do you think Americans today are not only biblically illiterate, but also constitutionally illiterate as well?
2 things. We rely on others to feed us. We're not self-feeders. We rely on others to feed us. And part of that, Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration, John Adams called him one of the 3 most notable founding fathers. So John Adams said you had George Washington, Ben Franklin, and Benjamin Rush, and nobody today has ever heard of Benjamin Rush. But he did a piece back in 1791. He signed the Declaration, ratified the Constitution. He's called the father of public schools under the Constitution. And he warned 2 things. He said if the Bible were ever allowed to be taken out of public schools, he said, number 1, we'd spend all of our time and money fighting crime when we could have prevented it in the classroom. But he said, number 2, he said the Bible, when not read in schools, is seldom read in any subsequent period of life. So what happens is in 62, 63, the U.S. Supreme Court in 2 decisions says, no more of this Bible stuff. We've had enough. We've done that 340 years. Let's do something else. So at that point, biblical literacy shoots through the roof because, again, if you don't read it in schools, you seldom read it later. So if you don't start reading the Bible when you're 5, 6, 7, you're not going to read it when you're 15, 16, 17, or 25, 6, or 7, etc. So we now have gone through really about 4 educational generations of we don't read the Bible. Well, we don't pick it up as adults. So that's part of the problem we have, is we rely on others to feed us. So I saw that in the news. Oh, I saw that on the web. I saw that in the media. Doesn't matter what you saw. Is it true? And so waiting on others to feed us, including the church. That's why I go to church on Sunday mornings to get fed. No, man doesn't live by bread alone. You have to have a daily meal. We eat food 3 times a day, and you only eat the Bible once a week, and that's for 30 minutes, 25 minutes. That doesn't work. You'll starve to death. So that's what's happened. We've really become a culture where we rely on others to feed us.
Now, I recently saw a special, I mentioned this to you briefly last night, that you did it on the Blaze, and you're looking at some key points of time, and I think Glenn Beck is onto something when you're seeing this movement that we've seen historically speaking. Do you mind telling our TNG people, what were the 4 key things that have made America, especially, you said we have to have, like, if you will, like ingredients that we have to hold to that made it great in the past, but if we're going to get back, if you will, to a constitutional America again, what are those 4 principles that America was founded on and that we need to fight for, to preserve as we move forward, to try to keep life and liberty that's God-given, to keep it intact and move forward to a more free country?
Yeah, actually, there's 5 things that I'll cover in the conference. On those 5 things, they all come out of the Declaration. They're our philosophy. From those 5 philosophical beliefs come 4 other things that we have. And part of those philosophical beliefs, number 1, in the Declaration, we say there's a creator. That's not individual belief. As the Declaration says, that's the unanimous declaration of 13 United States of America. That's a political declaration. There's a creator. Number 2, we say the creator gives a certain guaranteed set of rights. There's about 24 rights that come from God, not government. Government's not allowed to touch them. Those are the first 2 keys to having limited government. Is there's something higher than government, that's God. There are rights that government didn't give, therefore they can't regulate. So those 2 things give you limited government. The third thing is we say that government exists to secure those rights. So those 24 rights, the reason we have government is not so we can all have a job or a good economy or cops in the corners, is so we can do those 24 things that are inalienable rights. The fourth thing is there is a fixed moral law. They called it the laws of nature. Nature's God. That fixed moral law doesn't change across time. It worked 3,500 years ago. It'll work 3,500 years from now. That fixed moral law, government doesn't mess with. And the fifth thing is the consent of the governed. So once we get a fixed moral law and inalienable rights, then we get to decide how wide are the sidewalks, what's the speed limit, what are our municipal regulations, what's the weight limit on a turnip truck. That's ours. So those 5 things. Now, out of that comes the belief that you cannot have groups, you have individuals, because every individual has rights. What's happened in America and in France in the French Revolution, which we divided you into groups. We've done the same thing today. Hate crime laws. Oh, you're homosexual, lesbian, you get protection. Oh, you're senior veteran, you don't get the same protection. You get a different protection. Oh, you make a lot of money, we treat you differently from someone who doesn't make it. We tax you differently. God had the tithe. Everybody paid 10%, rich or poor. Now, the rich paid more than the poor, but it was all treated the same. So we changed that as we got into progressive stuff through the 16th Amendment, 1913. We changed capitation taxation, where everyone's treated the same, to where we treat you differently. So things that have made us different from the French Revolution is the belief in God, the inclusion of God in what we do, and that gives you limited government. Then you get into the groupthink mentality. Their mottos were liberty, equality, and brotherhood. That brotherhood stuff, it doesn't work unless God gave you equality. So those are the manifestations of those 5 philosophical beliefs, and that's what you have to have if you want limited government, a constitutional government, and if you want liberties, individual liberties.
That's excellent. I really appreciate the way you broke that down for our listeners. A couple final questions, David. One is, what do parents need to be doing? And secondly, what do pastors, particularly in churches, need to be doing in America to preserve what you just said?
One thing parents need to be doing is learning, because you can't teach what you haven't learned. And so we're told in Luke 6:40, Jesus says, every student will be fully trained to be like his teacher. Parents, if they don't know it, they can't impart it to their kids. The problem we have in America right now is in the last election, 70% of American voters, which is our parents, had no clue the Constitution was the supreme law of the land. 62% of American voters did not know the 3 branches of government. And that comes out of Isaiah 33:22. So that's a biblical literacy fault and a constitutional literacy fault. So you have to know it before you can teach it, which means, parents, you didn't stop learning when you graduated and got your diploma. You got to keep learning all the way through. So that's the aspect parents have to do. Pastors have got to get out of the box. They need to go read historically. They need to read biblically what pastors did. The book we just finished with Barna, if you ask a pastor, how do you measure success in your church, there are 5 things that they will give you. None of them are dependent on the Bible. What's the square footage I have in my church? How many staff do I have? What's the Sunday church attendance? How many programs do I offer? Wait a minute, I don't think any of that's biblical. As a matter of fact, if you're looking at attendance, don't look at John 6, because Jesus said, well, everybody else has left me. You 12 going to leave me too? I chased everybody else off for telling the truth. So you have to get to the point where you speak the truth. That's all you're required to do. What's happened in America is we don't know our own church history. We look at revivals, we think, we want a revival. You don't have a clue what that means. Number one, a revival usually lasts about 40 years. First Great Awakening, 40 years. So it's a transgenerational thing. Second thing is you got to remember theologically, and this is not where I am theologically, but I just tell you, in previous generations, you were Calvinist. Even Baptists were Calvinists, being free will, and that's a new thing in American history. So if you were Calvinist, you weren't doing evangelism because God's going to get people in. So what was the revival about? You preached practical things. You said, here's what you do when you get to work on Monday morning. And here's what you need to do with debt. You got to get out of debt. And here's what your government leaders are supposed to do about defense and immigration. Here's what they're supposed to do about taxes. And here's what the Bible says about capital gains tax. And you can't do that. You can't do an estate tax. You can't do a capitation. Those are sermons that come out of revivals. And what happens is people find the Bible so practical, they say, hey, I want that too. So you get church growth by being practical, not by doing the sinner's prayer. So we have come into the point where the Great Commission now means say the sinner's prayer rather than Jesus, who said, you teach them everything I taught you. Well, if you do that, you got to get into no-fault divorce in Matthew 19. You've got to get into due process, because in John 8, Jesus says, woman, where are our accusers, which is why we get the right to confront our accusers in the Sixth Amendment. We took that right from Jesus. I mean, if you're going to do everything Jesus said, then we've got to get into economics. We've got to get into employee-employee relationships. We've got to get into contracts. He covered all of that. We've gotten to saying the sinner's prayer and nothing else. So churches have got to get back to teaching God's full counsel, His entire Word.
The last thing, too, is I know you and obviously on the Blaze have really featured a lot of the Common Core issues, the initiatives. We know education is a big problem here in the country. There's a lot of things you said, I know, with indoctrination. Karl Marx obviously take over the heritage, change that. You can change the people. We know that Hitler took the educational system as well as state church. We're steadily, do you think as an historian, is that happening in America right now with our education and even with some of our churches that's turning it into more of a fascistic or communistic setting rather than a free nation that was built on God and freedom?
Well, if you're not built on God, you will go to man. And that's the problem. So many choices you got. So if we don't do a God worldview, we will do a man worldview. And the problem with the man worldview is it changes every time you get a new man up top. So John Quincy Adams called it the law of the tiger and the shark. And so you can't say what worldview that will be, because one leader's got a different worldview from the next, and the next, and the next. And so it's always constant flux, which is why in the same period of time America's had one constitution, France has had 16. Because their worldview is every time you get a different leader, we've got to have a new document. So the difficulty we have goes back to the 1920s in education. And in the 1920s, we changed from teaching students how to think to teaching them how to learn. And until we go back to learning how to think, Jesus, I love what Jesus did in Matthew 10, some of the other passages where he praised them for being shrewd. And shrewd means to use their mind in Greek. We don't use our mind. And Jesus lamented the children of this world are wiser. They use their mind better than the children of light. And that's the difficulty. Until we get back to learning how to think and not just learning, we'll never be a free people, because we'll always be dependent on what somebody else puts into us, and that won't work.
Last thing is, how do you get people not to focus necessarily on 2016, like that's going to change everything? What are the main things we need to be focusing on, not just in terms of prayer, but focusing to change culturally, politically, whatever, beyond just who we're going to vote for president?
There are 7 power centers in any culture. Any culture is shaped by 7 aspects. Those aspects, pulpit is one. It's now become a fairly irrelevant one because we've given up the pulpit, but the pulpit, education, government, business, media, which can include entertainment. I mean, you go through these 7 fields, they are always what shape a nation. And what we've done is we've pulled biblical principles out of all of them. So we don't run business. You go back to Adam Smith, who did the Wealth of Nations, 1776. Colleges today say that's the start of the free enterprise. No, it's not. You got to go back to 20 years earlier in 1759 when he did the theory of moral sentiments. He said, here's the biblical and moral foundations. Now let's talk about business. And so if you don't get God back into business, back into media, and by the way, in the 1960s, you could not bring a movie out unless the church approved it. The church said on the editorial boards in the 1960s, and we said, oh, we shouldn't be involved in secular stuff. Guess what? We've given all that over. See, until we get back into saying, you know, I've got to have a biblical view on computer programming. I've got to have a biblical view as a business, a chamber of commerce. I'm a leader in chamber, whatever it is. If we don't get that back to where that everyone's got a common worldview, and, you know, based on our documents, that again is there is a God. He gives you a certain set of rights. The government protects those rights. He gives a fixed moral law that I'm not allowed to alter, and then below that I can make decisions. Until we get back to that common understanding of the nation, you won't have a stable nation.
Last question, and David, it's been an honor. I can keep asking you questions all day long because I just love talking to you and interviewing you with this stuff. Your brain, your ability is amazing, and I wish more of us would just captivate that. So thank you for your time. Last question is, what are some things that you and Glenn Beck are doing together, and through that relationship, which I think is awesome, that you guys are trying to do to really, I hate to say it in terms of changing the landscape of America, but helping Americans, helping Christians wake up. So with your partnership with him, what are you guys looking to do as partners in the media world? Like you said, mainly he's a well-respected individual. He's got a big audience. What are you guys hoping in your partnership to help, if you will, change America for the better?
There's several things going. You have to, Ecclesiastes said, you cast your bread on many waters. You have to do a bunch of things at the same time because you don't know what's going to come floating back to you. So on the one hand, we do a lot of interning of young people. We take tons of young people and train them, get them thinking right, get them stuff we know they're not getting in college from professors. Secondly, we work with pastors very extensively. If you ever want smaller government, the church is going to have to do more. And from a biblical standpoint, there's over 200 verses on taking care of the poor, but only 3 of those verses are directed at government. And it says when the poor come into court, make sure they get justice. When the poor get in the civil process, don't treat them different from the rich. Everything is about civil process. Taking care of the poor, all verses come back to the individual, the church, and the family. So what we're doing is Glenn's raised millions of dollars. We distribute that wherever there's a disaster, the Moore, Oklahoma, or the blizzard that happened in North Dakota, all that. But we do it through churches. We go to the church and say, you need to be taking care of the people in your community. It's always the way poverty was in the Bible. The priest went into the home. They said, you know what? You need help for about 3 weeks. You need about 60% assistance. And it's the church that was the social arm. And so that's one thing we're doing. We're also working very much to re-educate Americans about history. We have a massive museum that's on the road that goes place to place. We call it the good, the bad, the ugly of American history. And unlike textbooks today who give you the bad and the ugly but not the good, we'll give all of it. Media, there's a footprint of about 50 million folks there. And so there's just a lot of things happening, working with businessmen, working with church leaders, working with kids, working with families, doing education stuff, Common Core, educators. You cast your bread on many waters. You got to work on all fronts at the same time.
David, you are a hero of the faith, and I admire you immensely. It's an honor to interview you right now. Thank you for joining us here at TNG 2014.
My pleasure. Thanks.